Hey, Chris, Ron here. How's it going today?
Hi, Ron. Going great. I'm very excited to meet again and dive into eAuction payment features and get into the weeds today on that.
Yeah, me too. Welcome, audience. This is the fifth in a series talking about e-auction. So if you haven't cut the first four, you'll want to go back and visit those, and I'll link them here at the end of the video. So, Chris, why don't we jump right in? Today, we're going to talk about securing and making a performance site and all the different types of payments that can happen on an e-auction site. So, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Ron. It's really detailed for auctions. It kind of depends on what segment of the market you're in. Depending on the segment, you may be looking for a high number of transactions and high frequency, or you may be dealing with very large transactions and making sure that the auction participants are highly qualified. And so
Yeah.
yeah, there really is a spectrum there, right?
Well, I think it's a term I've heard you use for years. It's high fidelity, right? So sites that are
Yes.
selling multi-million dollar Ferraris is certainly going to be different than one selling $20 Pokemon cards, right? There's a significant difference in fidelity. And when you're doing international payments like we were with Go Africa, even just the payment transactions are completely different. And the level of trust and how do you share millions of dollars securely across the world, right?
Yeah,
So
that's right. That's
let's
exactly
jump
right.
on in.
Okay. Sounds great.
So the first thing we want to talk about are the payment methods and the verification of payments. I know we just talked. I just made a comment about sharing across the world. Let's go ahead and dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. So basically, with international payments, just to set this up a little bit, one of the interesting challenges is that some of the actual vendors, some of the sellers, may not be trustworthy. And that can be hard to hear, but that can be the reality. And there can be a high level of trust, but still a just kind of mechanical kind of frequency of mechanical failures or logistical issues that can still cause there to be some trust issues, even in high trust environments. So it's not necessarily bad to consider what is the worst case and how can I make sure it's a great customer experience, notwithstanding that worst case. This was an extreme of that, in that we knew going in that the actual sellers, that the folks conducting an auction, if you will, they were not necessarily trustworthy. So, first of all, we put them through a process to vet and validate that their business was real and go through a rating and review process for them. But additionally, whenever it came down to the actual buyer, whenever someone made a purchase and they were the one who, in this case, won the bid, um, then they would have the ability to, as the buyer, uh, put their funds into escrow as opposed to going directly to the seller immediately. Now, this is really powerful because what it did was it behaviorally reinforced this logistical fulfillment process having to occur and having to occur successfully with the buyer receiving the items and accepting the items. Now, the other part of the equation is with high dollar, high ticket value items, there can be really key steps that need to happen with regards to contracts and agreements before the buyer even makes their first bid. And so this all kind of goes into the equation with an escrow type of a payment, right? So we want to make sure that expectations are managed before everyone kind of gets to the table. Once they're there, and that's kind of what we're, for the sake of brevity today, making the assumption that those pieces are already in place whenever we're dealing with an escrow payment. But we will point out that that's an area that we're happy to discuss and dive into in another video and in another discussion. But once someone has kind of agreed to these terms, be it they're purchasing a house, they're bidding on a house online, they're bidding on an exotic vehicle or a classic vehicle, or maybe a very expensive piece of jewelry or art, etc. The list goes on. Um, Maybe it's expensive machinery. These are all scenarios where they're probably going to be major ticket items, and they need to have a good understanding. They need to be a sophisticated purchaser, essentially, of that category of purchase. So we want to verify both the seller and the buyer. And then we want to make sure that there's a process for both of them to be able to essentially go through steps that are enforced so that when the buyer is going through their acceptance, they're actually a sophisticated buyer. They're not going to be denying the logistical delivery and the disbursement from the escrow to the seller because of some frivolous reason that isn't valid for that category of sales. So there are some really nice platforms that we've worked with and integrated into our core e-commerce platform. One of them is called Payoneer. A lot of folks who do escrow work have probably heard of or worked with Payoneer. They're an excellent company that's grown a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. And fundamentally, this company has a lot of built-in capabilities for international um, capability to execute on escrow. Um, there are also other companies like escrow.com, and really the list goes on. But the bottom line here, Ron, is that depending on your business model, you probably want to have a more sophisticated and more robust kind of expectation management and sign off process up to the payment and up to the winning bidder, if you will, and the seller, all understanding what the terms are and signing off and going through a pretty formal process with workflows and notifications. And then once someone actually does win the bid and completes a deposit or a earnest payment or the full payment, there needs to be some kind of capability around. There needs to be some kind of capability around the capacity to verify along the way. So that's what escrow allows you to do really easily. So, what are your thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, we had to do that with Go Africa, right? When we had Komatsu is in Japan selling, $3 million worth of combines to Kenya. Obviously, they want to make sure they get their $3 million, but Kenya wants to make sure that if they're going to put up $3 million, that they get the equipment that they so desperately need. And so, how do you do that securely? I've seen this on a smaller scale. I mean, I'm big into cars, and I've been to Barrett Jackson and Meekum Auto Auctions, and same kind of thing. If you're going to go in and bid on those cars, you have to do pre-verification to say you've got X numbers of dollars in the bank before you're even allowed to bid. And then if you do bid on a car, you have to have all the funds secured, paid for within 3 days, and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, it's definitely something that it's behind the scenes. You just need to make sure when you get a platform, you have a company or a vendor, someone like Clarity that you can literally talk to that has uncovered and knows what all those intricacies are, because you don't want to be held liable in the middle without providing those protections, right?
That's right.
Well, let's move on and let's talk a little bit about security. And there are so many different parts about security, and we talked about the high fidelity. So first off, just let's talk about high fidelity of the site itself. When I go to a URL and it pops up the little lock icon, right, and shows me that now I'm at an HTTPS URL, obviously that means there's an SSL certificate assigned there. Does that definitely mean that that site's 100% secure? And I'm leading you on that. Tell me why it might not be. Tell
Yeah.
me the difference between the SSL certs and what you need to know about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so even with SSL certs, there are different levels of fidelity, and you may notice this whenever you visit a site. The main thing to note is that essentially there are different levels of verification. So there's domain validated (DV), organization validated (OV), and extended validation (EV). EV is the most secure, so domain validated is the least, organization validated is the middle, and EV is the most. And whenever you go to a site with EV, you're going to typically see a nice giant big green lock, depending on your browser, or something of that nature. Now, like you said, Ron, a certificate, even an EV certificate, and there's a lot of detail that we can go into just on SSL and different types of encryption, et cetera. But even EV SSLs and encryption, it really is just kind of a baseline requirement just to get into the game. So you absolutely want to have an SSL encrypted site, all the communication going over SSL, that's for sure. But in addition to that, there are some other key factors that are absolutely critical for security. probably one of the biggest things that's surprising to most folks is within the site itself and for the users themselves. Many times nowadays, they will unintentionally and unknowingly, in many cases, give out their login information via phishing and malware, ransomware, these kind of things. So, believe it or not, that is probably one of the easiest areas for hackers to be able to get into a system or into an account and create problems. Now, specifically, a great way to address this is multi factor authentication. Now, believe it or not, multi factor authentication has become more and more sophisticated. Surprise, surprise, right? And most experts are recommending not just text based or email based multi factor authentication, because a lot of times these are kind of the first line of areas that get breached by a hacker. They're recommending using a actual security application that uses a token, a security token that expires after 30 seconds or a minute. If you've ever seen these, they're somewhat less convenient to use. So maybe the best solution, nowadays is to have multi-factor authentication for a typical user, allow them to say that they want the site to remember them, and kind of show them the options. They can use a security app if they want. If they don't, here are the ramifications potentially. And then for administrators, forcing them to use a very secure security application to log in. And that way, the more kind of robust roles that have access to more accounts and where there could be more potential risk, those are forced to use a more robust level of security. Now, the security really kind of covers, ideally there's kind of surface area in two places, and this is probably overgeneralizing, but within the application side of things you have a security surface area, and within the actual physical infrastructure. And without boring everyone with detail, basically on the application side of things, it makes a lot of sense to run consistent monitoring that's proactive. So, what does that mean? Well, there are third party tools that will run white hat hacking. So, you can think of this as like trying to simulate what the bad guys are going to do, but report it back to your team. In this case, if you end up working with the Clarity team, would be our team. um, Report it back to your team so that they can then remediate any issues proactively. So this would be before the bad guys get in. So by proactively white hat hacking and doing what's called pen testing or penetration testing, this will really help to keep your site kind of out of the fray, out of the easy target zone. That's on the application side of things. And there's a lot more fidelity we can go into, but that's a good summary for now. The other piece is going to be on the infrastructure side of things. And you can think of this as like, you know, you have the inside of your car where you lock the doors. Then you also have like the engine compartment, right? And that's your server and your IT infrastructure. Well, if that's easy to get into, you can have problems too. So we need to be able to secure and lock down that infrastructure. And again, giving you just a summary, and there's certainly a lot more detail we can go into in separate discussions. Whenever you're dealing with auctions, especially large auctions, any kind of online sales, there's a significantly higher amount of risk just because it makes the site a target. So you really want to make sure that you have a process in place for constantly patching and working with a team like Clarity that's going to go in and provide recommendations for maintenance and patching and updates to your application layer that's sitting on a server. And all of the server updates that need to happen. Unfortunately, it's just like a building, Ron. If you look at any building that's out there that's been built, if they sit there and no one maintains them for 50 years, 80 years, they literally
Yeah.
get eaten alive by organic matter. And it almost doesn't
Yeah.
matter what the material is. It literally gets decomposed by organic matter. So it's the same kind of thing, but on an accelerated timeline with security and making sure that your application is designed and architected for security from the get go.
Yeah. Totally agreed with that. Um, so let's say now that we've got our SSL in place, we've got our really highly secured hardware environment, we've done our pen testing, and off we go. The next big thing for me is performance, right? Because we've got clients. I remember a few years ago, we had the city of San Antonio contact us and said, we have 270 websites and we need you guys to do a complete analysis of all of our security, all of our performance, and do a complete audit of where we are today on all 270 sites and every server. But then we want you to put our 5-year plan together for performance and security and patching and all that. And I remember it took us like 4 months, and it was a 198-page paper that we put together, and it took us months to figure all that out, right? So that's big, and that's on an obviously huge scale. But these guys now, they're coming in and we're doing this big auction site that could potentially be huge and grow, and it might go from 10 auctions a day to 10,000 auctions a day. So performance could very rapidly become an issue. So we want to make sure when we install a new auction site for a client that we're planning for performance. So why don't you dive in a little bit when we're talking about what is performance and what the heck does that mean from both an application and a physical? Because I think it's almost the same thing, right? We have a SOA architecture, service-oriented architecture, and that architecture has as much to do with performance as does the physical hardware itself too, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's great. That's exactly right. It really can be kind of, you know, high level broken into application and architecture of the application performance, caching, etc., and then the infrastructure and scaling out and setting up performant infrastructure. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, we've worked with so many clients who have major promotions. They'll do marketing campaigns. They may have a news release, a press release, some kind of big advertisement, etc. And it works.
Yeah.
And as long as we can collaborate and plan, we can set the infrastructure and the application up to be able to dynamically adapt to high traffic scenarios. Or many of our clients like to go with what's typically referred to as a monolithic or kind of a single instance of an environment, and then scale that up for specific needs, and then scale it back down whenever those needs are kind of mitigated in the short term. So they may have a long-term growth trajectory, but spikes in traffic that are massive. So we don't necessarily want to consume capital, unnecessarily to deal with those spikes. So like you said, Ron, I mean, basically there are kind of two big areas where we can attack this. One is with infrastructure. And without getting too much into detail on infrastructure, the bottom line with the infrastructure side is that the infrastructure itself can be scaled out, and we can set up, because we're using a service oriented architecture, and we basically have the ability to split the application out into respective components that can then live on physical infrastructure that can be scaled out independently. That allows us to essentially infinitely scale the entire application and the performance, literally infinitely as needed, based on just increasing the infrastructure. And based on the capabilities of virtualization and cloud hosting and cloud infrastructure, this is relatively simple and relatively low cost, in particular if it's for spurts where there are major spikes. So this is something we would recommend. Now, the really cool thing about this is we can set everything up so that it's a low cost environment, but the environment can intelligently, dynamically grow and shrink on its own based on the traffic level. And we can set and configure variables that kind of drive this decision making that the infrastructure uses to scale itself up and down. And the other piece is, and there's a lot there that we could unpack later. But the other
Right.
piece is the application side of things. And one of the things that's really powerful on the application side of things is this service-oriented architecture and the ability to have NoSQL and caching capabilities that are extremely robust. One of the most interesting things about most sites is if you actually look at the data that gets transferred back and forth, most of it is duplicated and wasteful. So we're going to want to use caching mechanisms like turning on a CDN so the images and static files that don't change, they're not dynamic, they can get cached by a third-party provider like a CDN company, a content delivery network. Now, again, trying not to go too much into the weeds, this is kind of a surface area caching that will cache things like images and static files that support the site, like a logo or physical files that tell the site how to display. Now, beyond that, there's also dynamic content caching that we can do, such that when someone makes a request to the site and they're asking for a list of bids based on this filter, et cetera, we can then cache that request. And if anyone else within a certain time period makes the same request, we don't have to hit the infrastructure to ask for the calculations and the CPU and the RAM and the hard drives to be used. We have that in a NoSQL cache. And so you can just think of that as like you just heard something from someone and you remember it and you don't need to go look it up. It's the same thing for the application. The application has this ability to have kind of a short term memory, if you will. And this is really what the cache is. So we can configure this and optimize it and kind of precede that cache so that when users are on the site, it's extremely performant and it also reduces your overhead for your infrastructure. So these two are kind of tuned as you grow your business hand in hand. It can be somewhat expensive over time to continue to performance tune the application side of things beyond a certain threshold. There's kind of a law of diminishing returns there. So you want to essentially increase the infrastructure where it takes a lot of effort to increase the performance of the application. And then once you get to a certain level of traffic and performance need, then further optimize the application and just kind of keep tweaking as you scale your business. So you really want to look for a partner who can help you with this so that you can get a immediate value for your auction platform that doesn't require a lot of setup and sophisticated configuration, that just works and is performant. But it needs to be architected and designed and have a plan to be able to scale it up over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's what we look to do, Ron, whenever we're working with clients. And I know that, this is always a challenge for clients, right? Because as they scale their business, we don't want them to be painted into a corner from a performance perspective.
Right. Well, and we never know what scaling means. Does scaling mean they divest and sell off pieces of the business as they get wildly successful? Does it mean, like when I was at Altiris and we started being successful, it meant acquisitions. We acquired 9 different companies over the course of just a few years, and we grew. When we left Novell, there was about 12 of us, and we grew it to almost 2,000 employees. So, I mean, what is scaling? Does scaling mean 3 guys in a garage start up an auction site and it goes from 10 auctions a day to 10,000 auctions and it's still 3 guys? It's a teeny group, right? It's a small group of people, but the site itself is wildly successful. Or it could be going global. You mentioned the CDN and caching the images, right? Does that mean we go globally and the infrastructure scales? And that kind of brings us into our final section here, really about customability. And you mentioned that a minute ago. You said growing and tweaking, right? I think was the term you used a couple of minutes ago. And that's really what the platform has to do, because you don't really know what the future holds. So you have to have a platform that can literally do anything. And a lot of times when I'm demoing our platform, I talk about it as this modular platform, like a set of Legos. And often I'll say something like, you might need a Lego that's a 2x7, but you need it in hot pink and I don't have it. But as long as my company can build it and we can snap that Lego onto the set, I'll just build you a custom module, right? And that's what we do. We've got, 45, 50 some odd modules in our platform, but we'll have clients consistently come back and going, hey, do you have a module that does RFID scanning for the warehousing to automatically put inventory? Nope, but we'll build you that module, and we build it and snap it on, and now we have that module, right? So dive in a little bit and talk about how the extensibility of auction software, because there's a lot of different elements here, right?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. This is a really key aspect for the business. And fundamentally, what it boils down to is how can you heavily optimize around getting as much, if not all, of the off the shelf functionality that you need to operate the business the way that your customers, your auctions need to run to be fully optimized. So you want to kind of seek for this optimization around that, as well as all of the other factors that you are unaware of or that you will need down the road. And, that can include performance and security, and you may or may not be aware of the detail around that. So fundamentally, with customizations, this is going to be key because your business is going to change. Your customers' needs will change, and the standard that they require for you to and for your business to be seen as competitive or the leading uh, offering in the space that you're in, um, that standard will constantly change and increase. And so you really want to also look for a platform and a partner who can adapt with you and provide even suggestions and recommendations based on best practices within the auction space itself. So this is really vital. And from a capability perspective, it's very challenging from an architecture of a platform to make it so that it's easy to extend and customize while still being able to benefit from ongoing updates to the software. But that's really what you want, and this is a key aspect whenever you're doing your search for an auction platform, is to look for a vendor, a partner who's going to be able to make whatever changes you need to customize a workflow, to enable a special kind of intermodal shipping or freight shipping estimates, or make a really detailed escrow process like we talked about earlier. The ability to go through a very detailed visual inspection of a diamond, let's say, or a piece of art, or look at detailed documentation and sign off on it, have an approval process. The list goes on. But fundamentally, every single business will have different customization needs. Some of our clients want to be able to massively extend the platform and turn on really advanced, specific mobile applications that make it easy for auctions to be created by the sellers. And they're very specific to their industry. The list really goes on. And so, as you grow your business and as you're providing more value, how can the platform that you're working with enable that? And what you really ideally are looking for is the ability to also customize as it goes. So this is kind of a major downside mechanically of SaaS. SaaS has a lot of capability for off the shelf commoditized offering, but you can almost think of SaaS as like a Toyota or a Lexus. They're great vehicles, but they just have a certain number of variables and certain configurations that you can do, that you can implement. Whenever you work with a custom car manufacturer, like a Ferrari, for example, and then you cater that particular vehicle, you're going to get a much more performant vehicle, a much more highly tuned vehicle, and it's going to be completely customized. But if you find the right kind of software vendor, the software vendor like a Clarity, we're doing these projects all the time. We're constantly upgrading our platforms. So just like a SaaS offering, you're going to be able to take advantage of constant updates and changes that are improving things, constant recommendations from our work in the auction industry, in the auction space. And then you'll also be able to take advantage of this customizability that's built in.
I was just going to say one word in here. The confusion is when they start talking about single tenancy versus multi tenancy. And they think, I have to have multi tenancy, so I have to have SaaS. And that's not really true. It's single tenancy means that I have my own installation of the software. But when I install the software, it can be multi-tenant, right? It's like chase.com. They have their own software that they built, but they've got millions of people logging in, just like you can have your own single tenant installation of auction software, but yet have millions of sellers and millions of auctions running, and it is SaaS based and installed in the cloud. So people get really confused about this. Well, I have to have SaaS because it has to be multi-tenant, but yet they can still have a single tenant installation for their SaaS based multi tenant auction platform, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And this is, fundamentally, this is something that we recommend that if you're really looking to build a long term solution that's catered and matches what your business needs for your clients, for your end users, this is absolutely critical. and it can be a non-starter for pretty much any client that we've worked with over the last 16 years. If they kind of get stuck working with a multi-tenant SaaS-based type of solution, or even really just a poorly supported single tenancy type of model as well. Fundamentally, this ends up putting them into a kind of limiting position where they cannot customize and cater everything as they scale. And fundamentally, that ends up costing at some point more than the benefits of having a low cost kind of commoditized solution. So there is a cost benefit analysis that you're going to want to do when you're looking at the catering and the customization that you can do with a single tenancy type of model, but that's getting constant updates and upgrades to it.
Well, I agree. Well, I think that about covers it, unless there's anything else you want to tie off at the end of there. But appreciate everybody joining us today in this installment. Got another one coming up soon. Really look forward to seeing y'all. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Ron. I'm looking forward to the next one as well. Bye for now.
Bye for now.